The morning of September 30th, 1943, Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe sat in a briefing room at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, studying intelligence reports that had been compiled over the previous 6 months. The documents spread across the table contained production statistics from Allied nations, captured supply manifests from Guadalcanal, and interrogation reports from American prisoners. Kawabe had spent 3 decades in the Imperial Japanese Army. He had served in Manchuria, commanded divisions in China, and now served as Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff. He understood logistics. He understood industrial capacity. And as he read through the reports detailing American steel production for 1943, he understood something else. Japan had never had a chance to win this war. The numbers were precise. American steel mills had produced approximately 80 million tons of steel in 1943. Japan's entire steel industry, operating at maximum wartime capacity, had produced 7 million tons. The ratio was more than 11 to 1. But the ratio itself wasn't what made Kawabe pause. What stopped him was the realization that this disparity had been predictable from the moment war began. The intelligence had been available. The warnings had been given. And Japan's leadership had chosen to ignore mathematical reality in favor of nationalist ideology and faith in fighting spirit. Kawabe was not alone in this realization. By September 1943, 21 months after Pearl Harbor, many senior officers in both the Army and Navy understood that Japan was losing an industrial war it could never have won. The defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal had demonstrated Japanese vulnerability. But more fundamentally, captured American supply dumps and intelligence assessments of enemy production capacity had revealed the true scale of industrial disparity. American factories were producing war materials at rates that seemed physically impossible to Japanese planners who understood their own production limitations. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Imperial Conference that convened later that morning would establish Japan's new defensive strategy for the remainder of the war. But the strategy emerged from desperation rather than confidence. By autumn 1943, Japan's strategic position had collapsed. American and Australian forces had pushed Japanese defenders back through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. American submarines were systematically destroying Japanese merchant shipping, cutting off raw materials from conquered territories. American carrier task forces were growing larger while Japanese carrier strength had been decimated, and American industrial production was accelerating while Japanese production stagnated. Kawabe's role at this conference was to present the Army's assessment of enemy capabilities and Japanese defensive options. He had spent weeks analyzing intelligence reports, production statistics, and combat assessments. The conclusions were unavoidable. Japan could not match American production in any major category: steel, aluminum, oil, ships, aircraft, vehicles, ammunition. Every comparison favored America by ratios ranging from 5 to 1 to over 20 to 1. More critically, the gap was widening. American production was increasing monthly, while Japanese production was declining due to material shortages and bombing raids. The steel production figures exemplified the problem. Steel formed the foundation of modern warfare. Ships, tanks, artillery, aircraft frames, ammunition, everything required steel. A nation that could produce 80 million tons of steel annually could build thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, and essentially unlimited ammunition. A nation producing $7 million tons could not replace losses fast enough to maintain defensive strength, let alone mount offensive operations. The mathematics was simple and brutal. America could lose ships and replace them within months. Japan lost ships and never replaced them. But the steel disparity was only one element of a larger industrial imbalance. American aluminum production exceeded Japanese production by similar ratios. American oil production dwarfed anything Japan could access from captured territories. American shipyards were launching vessels at rates that Japanese intelligence initially dismissed as propaganda before captured documents confirmed the figures. American aircraft factories were producing more planes in single months than Japanese factories produced in entire years. The industrial gap was comprehensive and insurmountable. Kawabe had joined the army in 1913, graduated from the War College in 1923, and served as a staff officer during the Manchurian incident in 1931. He had been groomed for high command through assignments in military intelligence, operations, planning, and field command. His expertise was in logistics and strategic planning. Unlike many army officers who focused primarily on tactics and fighting spirit, Kawabe understood that modern wars were won through industrial capacity and supply chain management. Courage and tactical skill mattered in individual battles. Industrial production determined who won prolonged conflicts. This understanding had shaped his opposition to war with America in 1941. Kawabe had been serving as Chief of Staff of the China Expeditionary Army when the decision for war was being debated in Tokyo. He had access to intelligence assessments of American industrial capacity. He understood the risks. He had argued, though not publicly, that Japan lacked the industrial base to sustain war against a nation with 10 times its production capacity. But by 1941, the Bosingli II decision for war was being driven by the Army's desire to secure resources in Southeast Asia and by nationalist factions that believed Japanese fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. The oil embargo imposed by America, Britain, and the Netherlands in July 1941 had created a strategic crisis that pushed Japan toward war. Without imported oil, Japan's military and economy would collapse within 18 months. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies offered a solution, but seizing them would provoke war with America. Japan's leadership faced a choice between national humiliation through withdrawal from China and Indochina or war against enemies with vastly superior industrial capacity. They chose war, believing that rapid victories would secure defensive positions before American industrial mobilization could respond effectively. Kawabe had understood the flaw in this strategy. American industrial mobilization would not require years. American factories were already producing vast quantities of civilian goods. Converting those factories to military production would be relatively straightforward. American shipyards that built merchant vessels could build warships. American automobile factories that produced cars and trucks could produce tanks and military vehicles. American aircraft factories that built civilian planes could build bombers and fighters. The industrial infrastructure existed. It simply needed to be redirected toward military purposes. The intelligence reports Kawabe reviewed in September 1943 confirmed what he had feared in 1941. American industrial mobilization had occurred faster and more comprehensively than even pessimistic Japanese estimates had predicted. American shipyards had launched more than 900 major warships in less than 2 years. American aircraft factories had produced over 80,000 military aircraft in the same period. American steel mills had increased production by more than 20%, while simultaneously supporting massive civilian consumption. The industrial machine was not simply large, it was expanding. Japanese intelligence had actually been remarkably accurate in estimating American production capabilities before the war. Naval intelligence officers who had studied American industry understood shipyard capacity, aircraft production rates, and steel output. Their pre-war estimates of American naval construction through 1943 were within 10% of actual figures. Their estimates of aircraft production were similarly accurate. The problem was not lack of intelligence. The problem was that accurate intelligence contradicted what nationalist ideology wanted to believe, and political leadership chose ideology over mathematics. One intelligence assessment from early 1943, based on captured documents and prisoner interrogations, estimated American steel production for that year at approximately 75 to 85 million tons. The actual figure would be approximately 81 million tons. Japanese analysts had correctly estimated American production, but understanding the numbers and responding appropriately to them were different matters. Japan's maximum steel production capacity was approximately 7 million tons annually, and by 1943, actual production was falling below that due to raw material shortages and Allied bombing. The 11-to-1 ratio in steel production translated directly into military capabilities. America could build 11 ships for every ship Japan built. America could produce 11 tanks for every Japanese tank. America could manufacture 11 times as much ammunition. And America was doing exactly that. U.S. Naval construction, in 1943 alone, exceeded Japan's entire naval construction from 1937 through 1943. American aircraft production in 1943 exceeded Japan's total aircraft production for the entire war. Kawabe's analysis extended beyond simple production comparisons. He understood that industrial capacity determined not just quantity but quality of military operations. American forces in the Pacific operated with logistical support that Japanese forces could not imagine. American combat units received regular supplies of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. When American vehicles broke down, spare parts arrived within days. When American aircraft were damaged, replacement parts were available immediately. American soldiers ate well-balanced meals that exceeded peacetime Japanese military rations. Japanese forces, by contrast, were chronically undersupplied. Food rations were inadequate and declining. Ammunition was rationed carefully because replacement supplies were uncertain. Medical supplies were scarce, leading to preventable deaths from treatable wounds and diseases. Spare parts for vehicles and aircraft were nearly impossible to obtain, so damaged equipment remained inoperable. Japanese soldiers in forward positions often went hungry or relied on local foraging because supply ships couldn't get through American submarine patrols. The contrast extended to training and replacement systems. American forces could afford to provide extensive training to new soldiers and pilots because the industrial base could support training infrastructure. American pilot training programs graduated thousands of new aviators monthly from schools equipped with hundreds of training aircraft. When American pilots were lost in combat, trained replacements arrived regularly. Japanese pilot training, constrained by fuel shortages and limited training aircraft, produced fewer replacements. When experienced Japanese pilots died, their loss was permanent. By 1943, Japanese naval aviation had lost most of its pre-war trained pilots, and replacements lacked the skill to effectively use the aircraft they flew. The logistical superiority of American forces was visible in every engagement. At Guadalcanal, American forces had been supplied by regular convoys protected by naval escorts. Japanese forces had relied on nighttime destroyer runs that delivered minimal supplies while losing destroyers to American attacks. American casualties received medical treatment that saved lives. Japanese casualties often died from treatable wounds due to lack of medical supplies and trained medical personnel. American equipment that broke down was repaired or replaced. Japanese equipment that broke down remained broken. Kawabe understood these operational realities because he had reviewed after-action reports from Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Central Solomons. Japanese commanders in those campaigns had reported repeatedly that they were facing an enemy with seemingly unlimited supplies and complete control of supply lines. American positions were well fortified with adequate ammunition. American forces counterattacked with tank support. American artillery fired preparatory barrages that consumed more ammunition in hours than Japanese artillery had available for entire campaigns. The material superiority was overwhelming. The intelligence reports also contained information that disturbed Kawabe more than the production statistics themselves. American industrial workers were producing war materials while maintaining relatively high standards of living. American factories operated around the clock with well-fed, well-paid workers. American rationing of consumer goods was modest compared to Japanese deprivation. The American home front was not suffering. American civilians had reduced consumption slightly, but continued eating well, living in heated homes, and maintaining peacetime activities. Japan's home front, by contrast, faced increasing shortages of food, fuel, and basic necessities. The psychological implications were significant. America was waging total war without requiring total sacrifice from its population. Japan was demanding total sacrifice while losing the war. Kawabe had spent the previous 2 weeks preparing his presentation for the Imperial Conference. The presentation would need to be carefully calibrated. Too pessimistic, and he would be accused of defeatism. Too optimistic, and he would be providing false hope that endangered planning. He needed to present facts while allowing political leadership to make decisions, but the facts were unavoidable. Japan was losing. Japan had been losing since the Battle of Midway in June 1942, and barring a negotiated peace or American decision to abandon the war, Japan would continue losing until complete defeat. The conference chamber at Imperial General Headquarters was formal and austere. Present were Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who also served as War Minister and Army Chief of Staff, Navy Minister Shigetaro Shimada, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, and senior officers from both services. Emperor Hirohito would not attend this preliminary conference, but he would be briefed on its conclusions. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone present understood that Japan's strategic position had deteriorated dramatically since the optimistic days following Pearl Harbor. The question was how to respond to that deterioration. Tojo opened the conference by acknowledging recent setbacks. The evacuation from Guadalcanal in February had been portrayed publicly as a strategic withdrawal, but everyone in the room knew it had been a defeat. The loss of Attu in the Aleutians in May had been another defeat. American submarine warfare was strangling Japanese supply lines. American air raids were increasing. The situation required a comprehensive reassessment of strategy and realistic evaluation of capabilities. Tojo emphasized that assessments must be honest, even if conclusions were uncomfortable. Kawabe presented the Army's intelligence assessment. He detailed enemy force, strength in each theater. American ground forces in the Pacific numbered approximately 500,000 and were growing monthly. American air forces had established bases throughout the South Pacific and were expanding operations. American naval forces, which had been crippled at Pearl Harbor, now included more carriers and supporting vessels than Japan possessed. And most critically, American production capacity ensured that these forces would continue growing regardless of Japanese defensive efforts. He presented the steel production comparison: 80 million tons American production versus 7 million tons Japanese production. He explained what this meant in practical terms. America could replace every ship Japan sank. Japan could not replace losses. America could produce unlimited ammunition. Japan had to ration ammunition carefully. America could afford to waste materials on failed experiments and abandoned prototypes. Japan had to maximize every kilogram of steel. The room was silent as Kawabe detailed the production disparities. Aluminum production. America produced approximately 900,000 tons in 1943. Japan produced approximately 140,000 tons. Aircraft production. America produced approximately 85,000 aircraft in 1943. Japan produced approximately 16,000. Shipbuilding. American yards launched more tonnage in the first 6 months of 1943 than Japanese yards had launched in the previous 6 years. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Navy Minister Shimada challenged some figures, suggesting that intelligence might be overestimating American capabilities. Kawabe responded by citing captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and photographic reconnaissance. The estimates were conservative, if anything. Actual American production might be even higher than intelligence suggested. More importantly, captured American supply dumps at Guadalcanal had contained materials that confirmed the scale of American logistics. American forces disposed of equipment that Japanese forces would have repaired and reused. American supply discipline was so confident that usable materials were sometimes destroyed rather than transported because replacement supplies were always available. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu raised the question that everyone was thinking but few wanted to voice. If the production disparities were so extreme, and if American forces were growing stronger while Japanese forces weakened, what were Japan's strategic options? Could Japan win this war? Kawabe chose his words carefully. Japan could not win a prolonged war of attrition against American industrial capacity. The mathematics made victory impossible. Japan's only options were to make continued American advance so costly that America would negotiate peace, or to hold defensive positions long enough for circumstances to change. Neither option seemed likely to succeed, but no other options existed. Tojo interrupted. The assessment was too pessimistic. Japanese forces had superior training and fighting spirit. Japanese defensive positions could extract heavy casualties from American attackers. The Americans might lose will to continue if casualties mounted sufficiently. Kawabe did not argue, though he privately considered this reasoning flawed. American casualty tolerance was unknown, but American industrial capacity was known. Even if Americans suffered heavy casualties, they had the population and industrial base to replace losses and continue operations. Japan lacked that capability. The conference continued for hours, discussing defensive strategies, resource allocation, and diplomatic options. The conclusion was a revised defensive strategy that acknowledged Japan could no longer maintain the expanded perimeter established in early 1942. Instead, Japan would establish a defensive line running from the Kuriles through the Marianas, Caroline Islands, and western New Guinea to the Dutch East Indies. This absolute national defense zone would be held at all costs. Forces outside this zone would conduct delaying actions, but would be sacrificed if necessary. The goal was to make American advance so costly that a negotiated peace became possible before Japan's position completely collapsed. Kawabe understood the strategy was built on hope rather than realistic assessment of capabilities. American forces had demonstrated ability to concentrate overwhelming force against any position they chose to attack. American amphibious capabilities, supported by carriers and land-based aircraft, could isolate and reduce Japanese strongpoints systematically. The defensive strategy would slow American advance, but it would not stop it. And while Japanese forces fought delaying actions, American industrial production would continue increasing the material disparity. After the conference, Kawabe returned to his office and continued reviewing intelligence reports. One report detailed the composition of American supply convoys supporting operations in the South Pacific. A single American convoy might include 12 cargo vessels, each carrying 10,000 tons of supplies. Each vessel's cargo manifest listed food, ammunition, fuel, vehicles, construction equipment, medical supplies, and miscellaneous materials. The total supplies delivered by one convoy exceeded what Japanese forces in the entire South Pacific theater possessed. And American convoys arrived regularly, every 2 to 3 weeks, protected by naval escorts and air cover that prevented interdiction. Another report analyzed captured American equipment. American infantry squads carried more firepower than Japanese platoons. American soldiers had semi-automatic rifles, while Japanese soldiers had bolt-action rifles. American squads had multiple, automatic weapons. Japanese squads often had one light machine gun. American forces had radios at company level. Japanese forces often lacked radios below battalion level. The technological and material superiority was comprehensive. A third report examined American aircraft capabilities. The newest American fighters, the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, outperformed Japanese Zero fighters in every category except maneuverability. American fighters were faster, better armed, better armored, and had longer range. American bombers, particularly the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, could strike targets beyond the range of Japanese interceptors and could survive damage that would destroy Japanese aircraft. The qualitative advantage complemented the quantitative advantage. Kawabe had opposed war with America in 1941 precisely because he understood these industrial realities. He had studied reports of American production capacity compiled by Japanese military attaches in Washington during the 1930s. He had read assessments prepared by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied in America and visited American factories. Yamamoto had warned repeatedly that Japan could not win a prolonged war against American industrial power. Those warnings had been documented, distributed, and ultimately ignored. The tragedy was that accurate intelligence had been available before the war began. Japanese military attaches had visited American steel mills, shipyards, and aircraft factories. They had compiled detailed assessments of American production capacity. Intelligence analysts had calculated production ratios and warned that Japan could not match American industrial output. Admiral Yamamoto had personally warned Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but would have no confidence for longer conflicts. Every warning had been documented. Every warning had been ignored. Nationalist ideology had insisted that Japanese fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. Army planners had argued that rapid conquest of resource areas would provide materials needed for sustained war. Political leadership had convinced itself that America lacked the will to fight prolonged wars and would negotiate peace after early defeats. All these assumptions had proven false. Japanese fighting spirit, while genuine, could not overcome 10-to-1 production disadvantages. Conquered resource areas could not be exploited because American submarines sank tankers and cargo ships faster than Japan could build replacements. And America had demonstrated complete willingness to wage total war for unconditional surrender. By September 1943, the industrial disparity was manifesting in every aspect of the war. American carrier task forces operated with impunity because Japan lacked carriers and trained pilots to contest them. American submarines hunted Japanese shipping without effective countermeasures because Japan lacked sufficient escort vessels and anti-submarine warfare capabilities. American bombers struck Japanese positions regularly because Japan lacked adequate fighter strength and anti-aircraft artillery. The material superiority was translating into operational dominance. The steel production figures that Kawabe reviewed in September 1943 represented more than abstract statistics. They represented the physical manifestation of why Japan was losing. Every ton of steel became ships, aircraft, tanks, artillery, ammunition. The 80 million tons America produced in 1943 became approximately 900 warships, 25,000 tanks, 85,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of ammunition. Japan's 7 million tons became perhaps 60 warships, 1,200 tanks, 16,000 aircraft, and ammunition supplies that required careful rationing. But the comparison became even more stark when examining how that steel was utilized. American industrial efficiency meant that each ton of steel produced more finished weapons than Japanese production achieved. American factories used assembly line techniques perfected in civilian automobile production. American shipyards employed prefabrication methods that reduced construction time dramatically. American aircraft factories implemented standardized production that allowed multiple manufacturers to build identical aircraft from the same specifications. Japanese production, while skilled, remained more artisanal and less efficient. The American shipbuilding program exemplified this industrial advantage. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, American shipyards had launched approximately 1 million tons of naval vessels. In 1942, the first full year of war, American yards launched approximately 4 million tons. In 1943, production exceeded 5 million tons. The acceleration was possible because American industry understood mass production. Yards built standardized destroyer designs in 8 months. Escort carriers were completed in 3 months, from keel laying to commissioning. Liberty cargo ships were finished in an average of 42 days, with one built in 4 days and 15 hours as a demonstration. Japanese shipyards, working with limited steel allocations and traditional construction methods, could not approach these production rates. The Yamato, Japan's largest battleship, required 3 years to build. Japanese fleet carriers required 2 to 3 years from keel laying to completion. Japanese construction emphasized quality and durability, but in total war, quantity and speed of production mattered more than perfection. A ship built in 8 months that was 70% as capable as a ship built in 3 years was still operationally superior because it existed 2 years earlier. Aircraft production demonstrated the same pattern. American factories, produced the B-24 Liberator bomber at multiple plants using identical specifications. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan produced B-24s at a rate of 1 aircraft every 63 minutes during peak production. Consolidated Aircraft built them at plants in San Diego and Fort Worth. Douglas Aircraft built them under license at plants in Tulsa and Oklahoma City. Total production exceeded 18,000 aircraft. No Japanese bomber was produced in comparable numbers. The G-4M medium bomber, Japan's primary land-based attack aircraft, was produced in fewer than 2,500 units over the entire war. The production advantage extended beyond numbers to logistics and sustainability. American factories produced spare parts in quantities that ensured damaged equipment could be repaired quickly. An American aircraft damaged in combat could be repaired at forward bases using readily available parts shipped from stateside factories. American ships damaged in battle could be repaired at advanced bases equipped with materials transported from the United States. American vehicles that broke down were fixed using parts from well-stocked supply depots. Japanese logistics operated under constant scarcity. Spare parts were scarce because production prioritized complete units over replacement components. Damaged aircraft often remained inoperable because specific parts were unavailable. Ships requiring repair waited months for components because shipyards lacked materials. Vehicles were cannibalized for parts to keep other vehicles operational. The maintenance burden increased as the war continued and supply lines contracted under American submarine interdiction. Kawabe had access to reports from field commanders that detailed these logistical problems. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, who commanded Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, had reported that his forces faced starvation because supply convoys could not get through American air and naval patrols. The troops nicknamed Guadalcanal Starvation Island. More soldiers died from malnutrition and disease than from combat. The forces that were evacuated in February 1943 were emaciated, sick, and combat ineffective. Meanwhile, American forces on Guadalcanal received regular supply convoys that kept them well-fed and well-equipped. The pattern repeated across every theatre. Japanese forces in New Guinea reported similar supply failures. The overland advance toward Port Moresby along the Kokoda track had collapsed partially because forces lacked supplies. Soldiers carried minimal rations and depended on captured supplies or local foraging. When American and Australian forces counterattacked with full logistical support, Japanese positions became untenable. The retreat from the Kokoda track in late 1942 and early 1943 had been a nightmare of starvation and disease. The industrial disparity also manifested in petroleum products. American oil production in 1943 exceeded 1.4 billion barrels. Japanese oil production, including all conquered territories in Southeast Asia, was approximately 50 million barrels. The ratio was nearly 30-1. This petroleum disparity directly limited Japanese military operations. Aircraft couldn't fly without fuel, ships couldn't sail without oil, vehicles couldn't move without gasoline. Training programs were cut back to conserve fuel, resulting in poorly trained pilots and crews. Operations were limited by fuel availability rather than by tactical considerations. American forces faced no comparable fuel constraints. American aircraft flew training missions using as much fuel as needed to properly train pilots. American vehicles moved supplies inland using petroleum products that were never rationed. The operational freedom this provided was incalculable. American commanders planned operations based on tactical considerations without worrying whether fuel would be available. Japanese commanders planned operations knowing that fuel limitations constrained every decision. The steel production disparity also determined anti-aircraft capabilities. Steel was required for anti-aircraft guns, ammunition, and fire control systems. American forces defending against Japanese air attack had multiple anti-aircraft guns, radar-directed fire control, proximity-fused ammunition, and essentially unlimited ammunition supplies. Japanese forces defending against American air attack had fewer guns, simpler fire control, conventional ammunition, and strict ammunition rationing. the defensive effectiveness difference was enormous. American ships bristled with anti-aircraft weapons. Fleet carriers carried dozens of 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns, in addition to 5-inch dual-purpose main batteries. Battleships and cruisers carried similar armament. Escorts, the smallest combat vessels, still carried multiple anti-aircraft weapons. The anti-aircraft fire from an American task force could create a defensive barrier that few attacking aircraft penetrated. Japanese kamikaze attacks in 1944 and 45 would demonstrate that even suicide tactics could rarely penetrate American anti-aircraft defenses effectively. Japanese ships had fewer anti-aircraft weapons and less sophisticated fire control. The Yamato, Japan's largest battleship, carried 24 25mm anti-aircraft guns when completed in 1941. By 1945, desperate modifications had increased this to over 150 guns, but fire control remained relatively primitive and ammunition was limited. The modifications demonstrated Japanese understanding of the anti-aircraft deficiency, but industrial constraints prevented effective solutions. There wasn't enough steel to build guns, enough ammunition to supply them properly, or enough electrical equipment for radar fire control. The industrial comparison extended to every category of war materials. American production of aluminum, copper, rubber, and other strategic materials exceeded Japanese production by similar ratios. American factories produced more radios, more trucks, more construction equipment, more medical supplies, more everything. The cumulative effect was that American forces operated with material abundance, while Japanese forces operated under constant scarcity. Kawabe's intelligence assessment included captured documents from American units that illustrated this abundance. Supply requisition forms from American companies showed that requests for materials were routinely filled within days. Maintenance logs from American ships showed that spare parts were readily available. After-action reports from American ground units mentioned that damaged equipment was replaced rather than repaired because replacement was faster. The casual wastefulness, from a Japanese perspective, demonstrated how completely America dominated industrial production. One captured document that particularly struck Japanese analysts was a report on American ammunition expenditure at Guadalcanal. American artillery batteries fired preparatory barrages before attacks that consumed more ammunition in hours than Japanese artillery batteries had available for entire campaigns. American infantry units fired so much ammunition that supply officers worried about waste, not shortage. The report mentioned that damaged ammunition was sometimes destroyed rather than returned for refurbishment because transportation costs exceeded replacement costs. Japanese forces had never had enough ammunition to worry about waste. The intelligence reports also contained analysis of American industrial organization that explained how such production levels were achieved. American industry used standardization and interchangeable parts. An engine from one manufacturer could be installed in a vehicle from another manufacturer using the same specifications. Weapons were designed for mass production with loose tolerances that accepted slight variations. Training programs were systematized to produce large numbers of adequately trained workers quickly. Japanese industry, influenced by traditional craftsmanship values, emphasized quality over quantity. Components were fitted individually rather than mass-produced to standardized specifications. Weapons were manufactured with tight tolerances that required skilled labor. Training programs emphasized mastery rather than adequate proficiency. These approaches produced excellent equipment, but in insufficient quantities. A perfectly crafted rifle that took 2 days to manufacture was less valuable in total war than 5 adequate rifles produced in the same time. American industrial management also differed fundamentally. American factories operated continuously with multiple shifts. Worker productivity was high because workers were well paid, well fed, and motivated by clear production goals. Labor unions negotiated for better conditions but generally supported war production. Women entered the workforce in millions, replacing men who joined military service. The famous Rosie the Riveter symbolized a social transformation that Japanese society never attempted. Japanese industry relied on increasingly exhausted male workers and, by 1943, forced labor from occupied territories. The management of industrial resources also differed. American industry allocated resources based on production efficiency and strategic priorities. Factories that produced most effectively received priority for raw materials. Programs that failed to meet goals were cancelled and resources redirected. The system was ruthless but effective. Japanese resource allocation was influenced by institutional politics and service rivalries. The Army and Navy competed for resources, rather than coordinating production. Factories continued producing obsolescent equipment because bureaucratic inertia resisted change. Kawabe understood that these organizational differences were as important as raw production statistics. Japan's 7 million tons of steel production might have been utilized more effectively with better industrial organization, but even with perfect organization, 7 million tons could not match 80 million tons. The fundamental limitation was industrial capacity, and that capacity was determined by decades of economic development that Japan could not replicate quickly. The intelligence assessment included historical analysis of American industrial development. American steel production had grown from negligible amounts in the mid-1800s to over 80 million tons by 1943. This growth reflected abundant natural resources, particularly coal and iron ore, combined with technological innovation and capital investment. The Great Lakes region had vast iron ore deposits in Minnesota's Mesabi Range. Appalachia had extensive coal fields. Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana had developed integrated steel production that combined mining, smelting, and finishing in efficient systems. Japan had no comparable natural resource base. Japan's domestic coal deposits were limited and of mediocre quality. Japan had virtually no domestic iron ore. Steel production required importing raw materials, which made Japanese industry vulnerable to blockade. The conquest of Manchuria, Korea, and later Southeast Asia had been driven partially by need for resources. But even with conquered territories, Japan's resource base remained inferior to America's domestic production. The petroleum disparity was even more stark. America had vast domestic oil fields in Texas, California, Oklahoma, and other states. American refineries processed crude oil into gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, and other products using advanced technology. American petroleum infrastructure included pipelines that transported oil from fields to refineries to consumers efficiently. Japan had minimal domestic petroleum production and depended almost entirely on imports from Southeast Asian territories conquered after December 1941. Those imports required tankers that were increasingly sunk by American submarines. By September 1943, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By September 1943, approximately 1.5 million tons had been sunk. Replacement construction totaled perhaps 400,000 tons. The merchant fleet was shrinking, while demand for shipping increased due to expanded territory. Resources in conquered territories couldn't reach Japan because ships were sunk in transit. Without resources, Japanese factories couldn't maintain production. The entire economic system was entering a death spiral. Kawabe's assessment included projections of how long Japan could continue fighting under current conditions. The analysis was pessimistic. If American submarine warfare continued at current rates, Japanese merchant shipping would be insufficient to sustain the economy by mid-1944. Oil stockpiles would be exhausted by late 1944. Food shortages would become critical by 1945. Industrial production would collapse as raw materials became unavailable. The projections assumed no increase in American offensive operations. If American attacks intensified, as seemed likely, collapse would come sooner. The projections were classified at the highest level and shared only with senior leadership. Public morale required maintaining the fiction that Japan was winning or at least fighting effectively. Civilians were told that territorial losses were strategic withdrawals, defeats were portrayed as tactical setbacks. The American industrial advantage was acknowledged in abstract terms, but never quantified precisely. The public did not know that American steel production exceeded Japanese production by 11-1. They were told that Japanese fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. Kawabe personally believed that this deception was counterproductive. Public morale might be maintained temporarily, but inevitable military defeats would eventually destroy credibility. Better to prepare the population for harsh realities than allow false hopes to build. But he was not a political leader. His role was to provide military assessments, not determine information policy. So he compiled statistics, analyzed trends, and presented conclusions to leaders who would decide how to use the information. The September 1943 Imperial Conference established the new defensive strategy, but Kawabe understood it was a delaying action rather than a path. Victory. Japan would defend the absolute national defense zone as long as possible. Forces would fight to extract maximum casualties from American attackers. The hope was that mounting American casualties would weaken political support for continuing the war. Perhaps America would negotiate rather than pay the cost of complete conquest. This hope seemed unrealistic to Kawabe. American casualties at Guadalcanal had been substantial, approximately 7,000 killed. American public opinion had not wavered. American industrial production had not slowed. American offensive operations had intensified. The casualties that might discourage America from continuing would need to be catastrophic, far beyond anything Japan could reasonably inflict. And even if isolated battles inflicted heavy casualties, American industrial capacity ensured that losses would be replaced quickly. The fundamental problem was that Japan's strategy assumed American political will was fragile, while Japanese industrial capacity was ignored. In reality, American political will appeared quite strong, while Japanese industrial capacity was demonstrably inadequate. The strategy was based on hope rather than realistic assessment. But no alternative strategies seemed viable. Japan could not win through offensive operations because offensive operations required industrial resources Japan didn't possess. Japan could not negotiate from strength because Japan's position grew weaker monthly. Defense was the only option, even though defense could only delay defeat, not prevent it. In his office after the conference, Kawabe drafted a personal assessment that he did not submit officially. The assessment was brutally honest. Japan had lost the war the moment it started. The industrial disparity made victory impossible. The only questions were how long Japan would continue fighting and how much destruction would occur before surrender. Fighting to the last soldier and civilian would result in national annihilation. Negotiating peace while some bargaining position remained might preserve something of Japanese sovereignty and culture. But negotiated peace required accepting defeat, and Japanese political culture made such acceptance nearly impossible. The assessment remained in Kawabe's personal files. Submitting it officially would accomplish nothing except perhaps ending his career. The political leadership was not receptive to suggestions of negotiated peace in September 1943. The war would continue until circumstances forced change. Kawabe's role was to manage military operations as effectively as possible given the constraints he faced. He would do his duty as he understood it, even though he privately believed that duty was leading toward catastrophe. The steel production statistics he had reviewed represented more than numbers on paper. They represented the industrial foundation that would determine the war's outcome. 80 million tons versus 7 million tons. 11-1. The mathematics was simple and brutal. Japan had never had a chance. By early 1944, the predictions Kawabe had made in September 1943 were manifesting exactly as projected. American forces invaded the Marshall Islands in January, seizing Kwajalein and Eniwetok with overwhelming force. The attacks demonstrated everything Kawabe had warned about. American carrier task forces operated with impunity. American amphibious forces landed with complete logistical support. American air superiority was absolute. Japanese defenders fought courageously and died almost to the last man, but courage could not overcome 10-1 material disadvantages. The loss of the Marshalls breached Japan's outer defensive perimeter and provided American forces with advanced bases for further operations. More critically, the speed of American advance demonstrated that the absolute national defense zone could not be held. Japanese planners had expected the Marshalls to delay American forces for months. The islands fell in weeks. If outer defenses collapsed so quickly, inner defenses would fare no better against the same overwhelming material superiority. In February 1944, American carrier aircraft struck Truk, Japan's primary naval base in the Caroline Islands. The raids destroyed approximately 40 ships and 250 aircraft. Truk, once considered Japan's Pearl Harbor of the Pacific, was neutralized in 2 days of carrier strikes. The raids demonstrated that no Japanese position beyond range of land-based air support could be defended. American carrier forces could concentrate overwhelming air power against any target they chose. Japanese naval aviation lacked the strength to contest American carrier operations effectively. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided final proof that Japanese naval aviation was broken. Japan committed 9 carriers and approximately 450 aircraft to defend the Marianas Islands. American forces had 15 carriers and over 900 aircraft. The result was catastrophic. Japanese aircraft attacked in waves that were systematically destroyed by American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Approximately 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk, 2 by American submarines and 1 by carrier aircraft. American losses were approximately 29 aircraft. Kawabe, now serving as Chief of the Army General Staff after being promoted in March 1944, received reports of the battle with grim recognition. The result was entirely predictable given the industrial disparities he had identified the previous year. American industry had produced the carriers, aircraft, and trained pilots that dominated the battle. Japanese industry could not replace the losses suffered. The carriers sunk would never be replaced. The aircraft destroyed would take months to replace with inferior models. The pilots killed could not be adequately replaced at all. The pilot shortage was particularly critical. Japanese pilot training programs had emphasized quality over quantity before the war, producing small numbers of exceptionally skilled aviators. Those pre-war trained pilots were irreplaceable. When they died, as most had by mid-1944, replacements had far less training. By late 1944, Japanese pilots were being sent into combat with less than 100 hours of flight training. American pilots received over 300 hours before entering combat. The qualitative advantage complemented America's quantitative advantage. The loss of the Marianas Islands in July and August 1944 provided American forces with bases for B-29 Superfortress bombers to strike Japan itself. The first B-29 raid from the Marianas struck Tokyo on November 24, 1944. The raids would intensify over the following months, systematically destroying Japanese industrial capacity. The steel mills, aircraft factories, oil refineries, and other industrial facilities that produced war materials became targets for American bombs. Japanese industry, already struggling with resource shortages, faced direct destruction of production facilities. Kawabe understood that strategic bombing would accelerate Japan's industrial collapse. American bombers could destroy factories faster than they could be rebuilt. The bombing campaign would compound the submarine blockade's effects. Even if raw materials somehow reached Japan, damaged factories couldn't process them. The combination of blockade and bombing would strangle Japanese industry completely. Production would collapse. Military forces would run out of ammunition, fuel, and supplies. Organized resistance would become impossible. The steel production disparity that Kawabe had identified in September 1943 continued widening. American production in 1944 exceeded 89 million tons. Japanese production fell to approximately 5.6 million tons due to raw material shortages and bombing damage. The ratio had increased from 11-1 to nearly 16-1. And while American production remained stable at high levels, Japanese production was declining. By 1945, Japanese steel production would fall below 4 million tons as bombing destroyed mills and blockade prevented resource imports. American aircraft production in 1944 reached 96,000 units. Japanese production peaked at approximately 28,000 before declining. American shipbuilding continued at rates that exceeded Japan's entire war production. American ammunition production was so vast that shortages never occurred despite intensive operations across multiple theaters. Japan rationed ammunition strictly. Petroleum production exceeded 1.5 billion barrels. Japanese access to petroleum was collapsing as American submarines sank tankers and American forces recaptured oil fields in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies. By late 1944, the mathematical inevitability of defeat that Kawabe had recognized in September 1943 was obvious to any objective observer. Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to approximately 2.5 million tons, less than half the pre-war total. Oil stockpiles were nearly exhausted. Aircraft production was falling due to material shortages and bombing damage. Naval strength had been shattered at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October, where Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers attempting to stop the American invasion of the Philippines. Leyte Gulf was Japan's last attempt at decisive naval battle. The plan was desperate. Sacrifice carriers as decoys to lure American carriers away, then use battleships to attack American landing forces. The plan failed completely. American forces detected the Japanese movements and responded with overwhelming force. The battleship Musashi, sister ship to Yamato, was sunk by carrier aircraft. The remaining surface forces were battered by American air and naval attacks. The losses were irreplaceable. Japan's navy ceased to exist as an offensive force. After Leyte Gulf, Japan's only viable strategy was kamikaze attacks. Suicide tactics emerged from desperation rather than tactical innovation. Japan lacked trained pilots, effective aircraft, and ammunition for conventional attacks. Loading aircraft with explosives and crashing them into enemy ships required minimal pilot skill and conserved ammunition. The tactic caused casualties and damaged ships, but it could not stop American operations. During the Battle of Okinawa, from April to June 1945, approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties sank dozens of smaller ships, but no capital ships. American forces completed the invasion despite kamikaze attacks. Kawabe was not directly involved in kamikaze operations, which were primarily naval and air force matters, but he understood the tactical desperation they represented. Suicide attacks were not evidence of superior Japanese fighting spirit, though they were portrayed that way. They were evidence that conventional operations had become impossible due to industrial inadequacy. Kamikaze attacks traded trained pilots and aircraft for marginal damage to an enemy fleet that was constantly reinforced by American shipyards, producing replacements faster than Japan could sink them. By early 1945, American bombers were conducting systematic firebombing raids against Japanese cities. The raid on Tokyo on March 9th and 10th killed over 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. Similar raids struck Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and other industrial cities. Firebombing campaign destroyed not just large factories but thousands of small workshops that produced components for military equipment. Japanese industry had never been fully centralized. Many components were manufactured in small family-run shops scattered throughout cities. The firebombing destroyed these distributed production facilities, along with the workers' homes. The bombing campaign's effects extended beyond direct destruction. Workers who lost homes were less productive. Transportation networks were disrupted, preventing materials from reaching surviving factories. Power generation facilities were damaged, reducing electricity available for industrial production. The cumulative effect was comprehensive industrial paralysis. Even factories that survived bombing physically often couldn't operate because they lacked materials, power, transportation, or workers. Kawabe had access to industrial production reports that documented the collapse. Aircraft production in the first quarter of 1945 was less than half the 1944 level. Steel production was falling rapidly. Aluminum production had virtually ceased because bauxite imports had stopped. Oil refineries were producing minimal output because crude oil couldn't reach Japan. The industrial base was disintegrating exactly as predicted. Food shortages were becoming critical by spring 1945. Japan had always depended on imports for a significant portion of food supply. The submarine blockade had reduced food imports to negligible levels. Agricultural production within Japan could not feed the population adequately. Civilian rations were reduced repeatedly. Malnutrition became widespread. Military rations were also reduced. Soldiers in garrison received inadequate food. Forces in isolated positions faced starvation. The strategic situation by mid-1945 was hopeless. American forces controlled the Philippines and were preparing to invade Okinawa. Okinawa was Japanese home territory, only 350 miles from the main islands. American conquest of Okinawa would provide bases for invasion of Japan itself. Soviet entry into the war was increasingly likely as Germany's defeat approached. Japan would face simultaneous attack from American forces in the Pacific and Soviet forces in Manchuria and Korea. Kawabe participated in planning for defense of the home islands. Operation Ketsugo called for concentrating all remaining military forces to defend against invasion. The plan was desperate. Japan would mobilize entire civilian population. Men, women, and children would be armed with bamboo spears and grenades to attack invading forces. The strategy would inflict casualties on American attackers, but would also result in catastrophic Japanese casualties. Estimates suggested millions of Japanese civilians would die. The plan assumed that inflicting sufficient casualties on American forces would convince America to negotiate, rather than accept the cost of complete conquest. Kawabe considered this assumption questionable. American forces had demonstrated consistent willingness to accept casualties when pursuing strategic objectives. More fundamentally, American industrial capacity meant that casualties, while regrettable, did not threaten America's ability to continue operations. America could afford casualties that would be catastrophic for Japan. In July 1945, Allied leaders met at Potsdam and issued a declaration calling for Japan's unconditional surrender. The declaration warned that refusal would result in prompt and utter destruction, but did not specify what this meant. Japanese leadership debated the declaration. Some ministers favored accepting surrender terms, others insisted on continuing resistance. The debate was still ongoing when atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9. The atomic bombs killed approximately 200,000 people in 2 attacks. The destruction shocked Japanese leadership, though by July 1945, conventional firebombing had killed comparable numbers. The psychological impact came from the fact that single bombs had destroyed entire cities. If America possessed multiple atomic weapons and could continue dropping them on Japanese cities, Japan's population could be annihilated. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria on August 8 added additional urgency. Soviet forces overran Japanese positions rapidly, demonstrating that defense of the home islands would be even more costly than projected. Emperor Hirohito broke the deadlock among his advisors by personally deciding to accept surrender terms. On August 15, 1945, he announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. The war was over. Japan had been defeated exactly as the industrial mathematics had predicted. The steel production disparity, the aircraft production disparity, the petroleum disparity, all the material imbalances that Kawabe had identified in September 1943 had determined the outcome. After the war, American occupation forces compiled comprehensive studies of Japanese wartime production. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey analyzed Japanese industry, resources, and economic capacity. The reports confirmed what Kawabe and other Japanese officers had understood. Japan had never possessed sufficient industrial capacity to win a prolonged war against America. The production disparities were too extreme. American steel production exceeded Japanese production by ratios ranging from 11 to 1 to 20 to 1 depending on the year. Aircraft production disparities exceeded 5 to 1. Petroleum disparities exceeded 20-1. The survey also analysed whether Japan could have conducted the war differently to achieve better results. The conclusion was negative. Japan's fundamental problem was industrial capacity, not strategy or tactics. Different strategies might have delayed defeat, but could not have prevented it. Better tactics might have reduced casualties, but could not have overcome material disadvantages. The outcome was determined by production capacity, and that capacity was established by decades of economic development that could not be altered quickly. Kawabe survived the war and testified at war crimes trials. He was not prosecuted because his role had been primarily in planning and intelligence rather than operational command. He provided testimony about Japanese strategic planning and the decision-making processes that led to war. His testimony confirmed that Japanese leadership had understood American industrial superiority but had chosen to ignore its implications. The intelligence had been available. The warnings had been given. The mathematics had been clear. Japan had chosen war anyway. In testimony, Kawabe explained that Japanese military leadership had believed that fighting spirit and tactical superiority would overcome material disadvantages. This belief was sincere but mistaken. Industrial capacity determined modern warfare outcomes more than tactical skill or fighting spirit. Japan's soldiers had fought courageously. Japanese tactics had sometimes been effective. But courage and tactics could not overcome 10-1 production disadvantages. The steel mills in Pittsburgh and Gary produced more war materials than any amount of fighting spirit could counter. The comparison that Kawabe had made in September 1943 remained valid throughout the war and afterward. American steel production, 80 million tons. Japanese steel production, 7 million tons, 11-1. That ratio had determined aircraft production, ship production, ammunition production, and ultimately, who won the war. Everything else, tactics, strategy, fighting spirit, technological innovation, had been secondary to the fundamental disparity in industrial capacity. The lesson was clear, but had been learned at a catastrophic cost. Japan had lost approximately 3 million people during the war. Hundreds of cities had been destroyed. Industrial capacity had been eliminated. The economy had collapsed. Millions faced starvation. The nation that had entered war, believing spirit would overcome material disadvantages, had learned that modern warfare was determined by industrial mathematics. The mathematics had been explained before the war. Admiral Yamamoto had warned about American industrial capacity. Intelligence officers had compiled accurate production comparisons. The warnings had been ignored. Kawabe's personal assessment from September 1943 had proven prophetic. Japan had lost the war the moment it started. The industrial disparity made victory impossible. The only questions had been how long Japan would continue fighting and how much destruction would occur before surrender. Japan had chosen to fight until nearly complete destruction. The result was predictable and had been predicted. The mathematics had been clear. Japan had never had a chance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.